So they finally did it. After years of threatening military action against Iran due to the perceived threat of its nuclear program, Israel took the plunge and started a massive bombardment campaign against its regional rival, which was soon joined by the US themselves. Codenamed Operation Rising Lion, the Israeli attack managed to score impressive hits, decapitating the infamous Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps and crippling much of Iran's air defense network, paving the way for the American B-2 bombers to target the deeply buried Iranian enrichment facilities at Natanz and Fordo. However, despite those tactical successes, the combined Israeli-US operation may not have achieved its primary goal of ending the Iranian nuclear program, and was even further from any realistic prospect of regime change. As for Iran's retaliatory strikes, while somewhat muted, they still inflicted enough damage to ultimately push both sides towards a fragile ceasefire. Now that the dust has settled, it's time to examine what lessons can be drawn from this unprecedented war and what it means for the future of the Middle East and the global order at large. The first lesson that can be drawn concerns Iran's overarching security strategy, and especially its ability to deter aggression that was severely challenged during this crisis. First, it must be said that this attack is not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of tension and larval conflict between the two countries. Indeed, the hostility between Iran and Israel is nothing new, as both countries have been locked in a bitter rivalry for decades. On the one hand, Iran's theocratic regime has long called for Israel's destruction, branding it the Little Satan, while on the other hand, Israel sees Iran's nuclear program as an existential threat, warning for over 20 years that a nuclear-armed Iran is just a few years or even months away. Yet, despite this hostility, Israel and Iran have largely avoided direct clashes until now, with their rivalry playing out mainly through proxy wars in places like Lebanon, Syria, and Yemen. Iran's proxy network, the so-called Axis of Resistance, included the Lebanese Hezbollah, the Assad regime in Syria, various Shia militias in Iraq, and the Houthis in Yemen, and was managed by the Al-Quds force of the IRGC. It was the cornerstone of its deterrence and containment strategy against Israel, and was designed as a way to exchange blows with its adversary while avoiding direct confrontation. However, this approach was severely undermined when the US assassinated the Al-Quds force commander Qasem Soleimani on the 3rd of January 2020, signaling a shift toward directly targeting Iranian assets. In many ways, this event can be considered as the inflection point that set in motion the steady escalation culminating in the recent war. In particular, what needs to be underscored here is that Iran's response, which consisted in a missile salvo on US bases in Iraq, but carried out only after having warned the Americans, proved too restrained to effectively deter further aggression. Since then, the recent war in Gaza offered Israel an opportunity to further break the proxy war-induced stalemate. By sucking in the Hezbollah, the conflict created a chain reaction that greatly damaged Iran's axis of resistance. As the Hezbollah was a major contributor to the Assadist grip on Syria, its weakening ultimately paved the way for the victory of the Syrian rebels and the ousting of al-Assad from power. This collapse of Syria's regime, a key Iranian ally, left Iran exposed, with no effective response to counter the unraveling of its regional influence. Israel dealt further blows to Iran in 2024. On the 1st of April, Israel bombed the Iranian embassy complex in Damascus, and then on the 31st of July, Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh was assassinated in Tehran during the inauguration of Iran's new president, Masoud Pezeshkian. These humiliating blows led Iran to retaliate through the operations True Promise 1 and 2, where Iran fired hundreds of missiles at Israel to demonstrate its capabilities and restore deterrence. However, Iran's cautious targeting of non-critical sites failed to deter Israel, instead emboldening further aggression. To sum up, each escalatory move by Israel and the US exposed Iran's restrained and ineffective responses, fueling further escalation that culminated in the recent war. In fact, Iran's response to Israel's Operation Rising Lion followed the same pattern and appeared underwhelming, at least at first. Even though this time Iran seems to have dealt enough damage to Israel to make a ceasefire desirable, but it remains uncertain whether it restored a credible deterrence posture, leaving the region on edge. In the end, Iran's adversaries managed to eliminate a considerable number of its most senior and experienced commanders, and Iran proved unable or unwilling to respond symmetrically. Besides, Iran's failure at deterrence is further compounded by two factors. The first is the apparent Iranian failure on the intelligence front. Indeed, Israel's attack showed that Iran was infiltrated by scores of Mossad operatives, as many of the strikes originated directly from within Iran, using drones and short-range missiles. The most striking example of this intelligence failure is the spectacular decapitation of the IRGC, reminiscent of that of the Hezbollah. While it's difficult to draw definitive conclusions, Israel's dominance in the intelligence battle, possibly leveraging a faster ODA loop, can explain Iran's cautious retaliation as seen in its restrained missile strikes during Operation True Promise 3. The second factor undermining Iran's deterrence is its limited global standing and apparent isolation that have been exposed during this crisis. Indeed, despite forging closer ties with Russia and China through recent strategic partnerships, Iran stood alone as Israel's Operation Rising Lion devastated its nuclear and military infrastructure. Iran signed a comprehensive strategic partnership with Russia on the 17th of January 2025 and a similar 2021 agreement with China, focusing on trade, energy and military cooperation. However, neither treaty includes a mutual defense clause, leaving Iran without direct military support from its allies during the conflict. Notably, Russia reportedly proposed a mutual defense pact akin to the one inked with North Korea in 2024, which Iran purportedly declined to preserve its sovereignty and avoid being entangled in a Russian-led bloc. This isolation exposed Iran's strategic vulnerabilities. While the country has developed a robust domestic defense industry, producing drones like the Shahed series and ballistic missiles like the Fatah, its mainly indigenous air defense network seemingly underperformed in the face of the Israeli attack. This failure underscores how Iran is still far from being a great power, despite wanting to be seen as one. One notable consequence of this ordeal for Iran is the apparent deepening of its frustration with Russia due to the lack of effective support in the face of foreign aggression. Namely, many inside Iran have criticized Russia for failing to deliver critical pieces of military equipment which would have helped Iran defend itself, such as Su-35 fighter jets or S-400 air defense systems, possibly due to Russia's commitments in Ukraine, but maybe also under Gulf states and Israeli pressure. Yet Iran can hardly blame Russia for all its problems, especially when it seems it is Iran that refused a bilateral defense pact between the two countries, as said before. And Russian voices, including Putin himself, have been pushing a different narrative, one that blames Iran for refusing to buy Russian weapons. Nevertheless, this highlights the complexity and the transactional nature of the Russian-Iranian relationship, marked by cooperation but strained by rivalry and mistrust, ultimately leaving Iran isolated and its deterrence weakened. But it is not only Iran that has seen the limits of its policy. Indeed, another major lesson that can be drawn for both Israel and the US is that despite their tactical successes, their use of force did not produce the full desired effects. As mentioned earlier, Israel has a history of using military force to address geopolitical challenges, often with significant success. This could have convinced Israeli leaders that escalation and military action, rather than diplomacy or appeasement, could resolve the Iranian question. Their maximalist approach, evident in Operation Rising Lion's ambitious goals to not only halt Iran's nuclear program but also change its regime, suggests a belief that force could achieve both security and political transformation. However, this was probably a miscalculation, as Iran, a large state of more than 90 million inhabitants, is much more resilient than Hamas or Hezbollah. In the Iranian case, targeted assassinations of both military leaders and senior scientists are likely much less effective, as the state is able to swiftly bring in replacements, and its overall resilience was clearly underestimated by its adversaries. The same goes for the Iranian nuclear program. Despite its ability to strike at will inside the Iranian territory, Israel was not capable of dealing significant damage to the deeply buried enrichment plants of Natanz and Fordo, and had to call in the US in hope their bunker buster capability could do the job. The American B-2 bombers, equipped with the GBU-57 massive ordnance penetrator, did then attack those critical sites, focusing especially on Fordo, and quickly President Trump proclaimed victory, asserting that those facilities have been entirely destroyed. Yet, significant doubts remain as of the results of these strikes. Many experts, even in the American intelligence community, are skeptical, as the stated capabilities of the MOP were not sufficient for the task at hand, and the Iranians, while conceding that they did suffer substantial damage, claim for their part that most of the equipment and enriched uranium have been evacuated from Fordo in advance, and that the facility will be quickly repaired. In all cases, even if substantial damage have been dealt to those critical plants, Iran still retains a substantial amount of enriched uranium that it could weaponize, and maybe more importantly, the institutional knowledge underpinning the Iranian nuclear program has been largely left untouched, meaning the reconstitution of these capabilities is only a matter of time. In fact, the Pentagon itself is now claiming that Iran's nuclear program has been delayed by only 2 years, implying that the matter is far from being resolved. Finally, the war also revealed an intrinsic weakness in Israel. Not only it was incapable of achieving its objectives, but its own territory came under attack in an unprecedented way. Throughout the 12 days of fighting, Iran's missile salvos, launched mostly at night, were initially seen as underwhelming, as they consisted of only a few dozen missiles each time, and Israel claimed high interception rates. In fact, many questions were raised about Iran's ability to launch missiles in sufficient numbers, and whether its launchers had been degraded by Israeli strikes. Yet, despite this relatively cautious and puzzling approach, Iran still managed several hits on Israeli military bases and critical infrastructure. One of the most significant strikes was on the Bazan oil refinery complex in Haifa, which supplies more than half of Israel's diesel and gasoline, and is expected to resume full operations only in October. Hence, Israel's weakness lies in its small size and the relatively limited number of critical infrastructures that, if targeted by an enemy, could have a devastating impact on the country. For instance, just 5 desalination plants supply most of Israel's freshwater and could have been attacked if Israel had struck Iran's oil and gas infrastructure. Thus, even though Iran largely failed at deterrence prior to the war, its ability to carry out precise strikes on these vital Israeli facilities proved sufficient to force a ceasefire. Now to the third and perhaps most important lesson, which is that the Israel-Iran conflict exposes the accelerating unraveling of the global order. Israel justified its attack under the preventive war doctrine, claiming it was necessary to eliminate an existential threat. Western leaders, under the familiar motto "Israel has the right to defend itself," quickly backed the Jewish state, even though it was Israel that initiated the attack. Most bizarrely, Germany's foreign ministry condemned Iran's aggression before Iran had even retaliated, underscoring the West's unconditional support for Israel. What is notable here is that Russia used the same preventive war doctrine to justify its invasion of Ukraine, claiming that Ukrainian territory was being militarized by NATO and would inevitably be used as a springboard for future attacks on Russia. Yet in that instance, Russia's attack was labeled an unprovoked aggression, and the West swiftly imposed heavy sanctions. This inconsistency reveals a deeper problem. The preventive war doctrine can be weaponized by any country to justify aggression, undermining the very spirit of international law. If nations are allowed to strike first based on perceived future threats, which is necessarily subjective, the rules-based global order begins to crumble. What is more, in the specific case of the Israeli attack on Iran, the imminence of the threat is far from being established. Israel's justification rested on the claim that an Iranian nuclear bomb was imminent, a matter of weeks or even days. However, ample Western and particularly American intelligence prior to the attack reaffirmed that an Iranian bomb was still years away. In particular, US Director of National Intelligence Tulsi Gabbard testified before Congress in March that Iran was not building nuclear weapons, before changing her stance after Israel initiated its attack. Moreover, the whole case collapses when it is stressed that the attack happened in the midst of negotiations with the US that were scheduled in Oman, and that members of the negotiation team were directly targeted by the Israeli assault, such as Ali Shamkhani, a close advisor to Khamenei who was injured in the bombing. In fact, Shamkhani even insisted just weeks before the war that Iran was ready to scale back uranium enrichment and to commit to never build a nuclear weapon, in exchange for the lifting of sanctions on Iran, underlining that the Iranians were ready to make substantial concessions to break the diplomatic deadlock. Of course, Iran's adversaries can claim that Tehran was not negotiating in good faith, but it is worth remembering that it was the US under President Trump that unilaterally withdrew from the original Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, in 2018. The spirit of the world order inherited from World War II rests on diplomacy and the rejection of military aggression and violence as legitimate geopolitical tools. However, conflicts such as this one contribute to the erosion of that international framework. In recent decades, Western powers, and the US in particular, have been major contributors to this process, as exemplified by the wars in Iraq and Libya. Thus, the current events are merely the latest steps in a continuous process led, ironically, by the very countries that are often the most vocal about upholding international law. Paradoxically, one of the effects of this unraveling of the global order is the encouragement of nuclear proliferation. Indeed, in a world where international law and security guarantees are no longer respected, nuclear weapons become the ultimate deterrent against invasion and regime change attempts. Another consequence is the rise of bilateral and multilateral defense agreements, such as the one recently signed between Russia and North Korea. Smaller countries are once again seeking to align themselves with great powers capable of protecting them. This is especially relevant for Iran, which, at least according to Russian sources, has refused such an agreement with Moscow in the past. Now, Iran will have to decide which path to pursue. And given recent events, it would not be surprising if the Israeli-American attack, far from destroying its nuclear ambitions, only further motivates the Iranians to seek nuclear weapons.